Köszöntöm a Szubjektív nézőit. A mai műsorban egy igazán különleges vendéget köszönhetek. Innen a Palicsi tó partjáról Brian Cox világhírű színművésszel beszélgetünk. Mr. Cox, thank you for taking the time.
You're welcome.
To talk to us. This is not your first time in Serbia.
No.
How did you feel when you filmed Coriolanus here with Ralph Fiennes?
Well, it was, because it was just really immediately after the conflict. And so it was very interesting to come here. Slightly nervous making because I didn't, you can never know about something until you go there. I mean, we see on the news all the time, but we never really know what the real problem is or the real difficulties are until you actually get a sense of the country and the pride of the people involved. So it was fascinating. It was particularly fascinating doing a script like Coriolanus, which is about a man who turns his back on the empire, which is Rome, and because of his own sense of his own righteousness. And I thought it was very thematic of how certain people behaved during, the conflict in the early 90s. So it was, to film, for example, in the Parliament House, where a lot of deeds had been done, and we were doing deeds from the Roman period, but they didn't seem totally amiss there. There was a sort of kind of harmony between the two, a sort of zeitgeist kind of quality about it. So I loved it, and I particularly loved Belgrade. I fell in love with Belgrade, and I can't even remember what it's called, but a fantastic fish restaurant in Belgrade, which I went to, which was exquisite.
You are one of the biggest actors in Europe and in the world, and how was it for you acting when you grew up, and what is it different in nowadays, an actor's job?
Well, it's different. The thing about acting is that it's not a profession of security. There are no guarantees. The only guarantee is what you put into it, your commitment to the work. And I've been doing it since I was 15, so I've done it for, not quite, but within a couple of years or so, I will have been doing it for nearly 60 years. So, and it's served me well. Because it's about the imagination. It's about human beings, how human beings behave, and it's still a mystery to me, and it's still fascinating just from a psychological and a clinical point of view, how you create an animal that has a 360-degree world and is total, and you put it on a screen. And I feel very blessed that I've been given A, the opportunity to do that, and B, that I'm continuing to give the opportunity to do that. So I sort of count my blessings, and it's rather humbling when you come to somewhere like Palic, and they offer you the Alexander Livka Lifetime Achievement Award, and you go, well, I mean, obviously I must have done something right.
And how do you feel about getting Life Achievements Award? Because one of your colleagues, Robert De Niro, said that when someone gets Life Achievements Awards, it means that they're getting a bit older, but also, as you said it, you did something right.
Well, I think that's it. I mean, I think you are getting older. I think it validates, I'd like to put it this way, it validates, in a way, the journey of your career. It doesn't necessarily about your career, but it's your journey. It's the stuff that you have done, when you see before I was given the award, they screened excerpts from films, and even me just sitting there going, wow, and I forget that. I mean, I forget what I've done, and I forget the effect of what I've done. Because there I am, I do my work, I go to the next job, I do that, I go to the next job, I do that. And then I have my house, I have my wife, and I have my 2 sons, and I have my children from my ex-marriage, and they're now growing up and everything. So that's your life. But you forget about your effect in the world. You don't want to start thinking about that too much, because it can go to your head and you can go, I know actors who have moments where they're so full of themselves.
Out of their head, yes.
Over their heads. And I've always been like that about it. But at the same time, it is humbling, and you have to accept there is a fact element to it, that if you do the amount of work that you've done, and if you're consistent in the work you've done, it will have an effect. And you have to accept that's, and you look upon it and you think, how do I treat this? What does this mean? It's, of course, it's extraordinarily pleasing, but what is it about? And you go, well, it validates why you do what you do.
And you talked about creating characters, and you played Winston Churchill brilliantly. But in the same year, another Winston Churchill was in theaters, movie theaters, with Gary Oldman. Did you talk to him about the performance? No. Or you never talk with colleagues?
We're very possessive actors of what we do. You know, we never really talk about the, you know, maybe down the line we will, I mean, I still, Anthony Hopkins and I have worked together, but we've never, ever mentioned Hannibal Lecter to one another. People have mentioned on our behalf. And I remember years ago, I was lying in a hotel room in Amsterdam, and my agent, who used to be Tony's agent, rang up and said, you know, Tony's very upset because there's an article going, I was the first Hannibal Lecter, and me. And I went, well, I never said that. You know, that was the press who said he was the first. And I didn't go around and say, well, you know, I'm the first Hannibal. You know, we don't think like that. We know that everything's up for grabs as actors, so that you can't be possessive about it. You are possessive in the moment. Yes, you have to be.
With the performance, yes.
With the performance, but when it's done, you let go of it. So with Gary, I know that he used a great deal of prosthetics. I don't go that way. I would rather transfer myself physically myself by doing it through my acting. I don't want to go down that road. Gary is quite thin. He's quite, you know, he's very, very physically different from Churchill. I am more inclined that way. So, in a sense, there's a greater advantage. But also, it's also of the time. It's what people, you know, and this is something that's happened now with awards. That they have this thing called award season, which means that films come out at a certain time and they're regarded for that period. Now, if a film comes out early, they forget about it and they say, oh no, it's not in the award season period, you know. Whereas in the old days, the award meant the work over a year, you know, but it doesn't mean that anymore, you know. So in a sense, you know, it's, you know, you begin to look at things like Oscars and Emmys and that kind of thing, which are nice and lovely and all that. And I've won an Emmy. I'm very grateful. I've won lots of awards, but I don't take them seriously. I mean, I'm graceful enough to acknowledge them, but they're not. You know, I'd rather have a job than an award.
And you talked about award season and how movies are made. You started in a transition period when the big studios started to descend to some independent production companies, and we are now back in a period where big studios are trying to overwhelm the industry. How do you feel about these times? How did you feel about when you started and today?
Well, when I started, the cinema was much more egalitarian and it was much more open. And the influences of European cinema were very strong. You know, when I think of, you know, the effect that, for example, Milos Forman had when he came to America and he made those films like Getting Out, Coming Away, those films about America. They were like documents at the time. And then he went on to make One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and then finally Amadeus. And you look at Amadeus and it's a classic. And he didn't follow any of the rules. He did it his way. And it's an exceptional film. I just rewatched it because my boys had never seen it. So the other day we watched it and they would go, wow, you know, they didn't know. So there was there was a cinema that was much more dedicated to story, much more dedicated to the idea of something, as opposed to things which are about comic books, you know, the comic book mentality. Now, I'm a great comic person. I mean, I've loved comic books all my life, you know, I mean, I love them. And they have their place, but it's their place. I don't look upon it as the main thing in cinema, you know. And I do kind of think, well, Marvel and DC have sewn up that market, and they've got those cinemas, as I spoke about in the press conference. What about the other movies? You know, and so, I mean, one of my great hobbies at home is to watch TCM, Turner Classic Movies, which I think is fantastic. And it's one of the great gifts of America for me, is to go, and that's how I started. I mean, when I started as a child, I went to see double features.
And do you have some heroes in cinema because you watch
yeah.
TCM?
Yeah. I mean, heroes like, directors like Lindsay Anderson, John Ford, David Lean, Carl Rice.
And about actors? What about
actors? Brando, Spencer Tracy is one of my great heroes as an actor. Humphrey Bogart, Gary Cooper, James Stewart, Cary Grant. Cary Grant is one of the truly remarkable actors of all time. And even people like Hugh Grant, you know, who I think is a very underrated actor who does these romantic comedies, but he does them so brilliantly and he does them so effortlessly, and he makes the acting look so much easier, but it isn't. It's difficult. So, you know, I have great admiration for certain people.
And for lastly, what will you say, or do you say something to the young generation when you make a movie with some young actors? What do you say to them?
I just say do the work. You know, make sure your instrument is working. That every aspect of you is working, physically, vocally, mentally, that it's all working. And you practice, you know. That's one of the problems. I mean, they do class, they go to class, but class is, it's not the same thing as just actually getting up there and doing it.
Mr. Cox, it was an honor talking to you.
My pleasure.
Have a good luck and have a good life.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Gabor.
Nézőknek pedig köszönöm a figyelmet, a Szubjektívben Brian Cox-szal, világhírű brit színésszel beszélgettünk.